Meaningful change in schools starts with true buy-in from teachers and leaders. But resistance is real. Overloaded with initiatives, educators often feel unheard and overwhelmed. Our online course, Motivational Interviewing, Getting Educator Buy-in, empowers you to create genuine collaboration. Learn to build trust, align with their values, and inspire lasting commitment, not just compliance. Ready to transform engagement? Enroll now at thebehavioraltoolbox.com.
Okay, think real quickly. What's 47 minus 12? What did you have for breakfast the day before yesterday? When is the next leap year? Hit pause and try to answer these, and then come back to the show. All right, you're back now. Okay, don't worry. I'm not going to hold you to your answers. What's more important are the processes you went through to derive those answers. If you find this sort of thing interesting, then this is the podcast for you. Dr. Judah Axe joins me in session 282 to discuss a behavioral interpretation of problem solving. Judah is a professor in the Department of Behavior Analysis at Simmons University. And along with Drs. Alberto and Anne Troutman, he is the author of Applied Behavior Analysis for Teachers, which, by the way, is a very thorough and comprehensive book. We get into this topic of problem solving very deeply here, and here are just some of the topics we hit on. We talked about, of course, in behavioral terms, what constitutes a problem. We talked about how Skinner first conceptualized problems and problem solving. We talk about how self-talk, visualization, and other private events play roles in this problem-solving process. We talk about how we both wish we had stronger backgrounds in developmental psych. We talk about Blooms Taxonomy. We, speculate on current educational practices that potentially impede the development of higher-order problem-solving. And in the process of doing that, perhaps sound like a bunch of grumpy old men, but that's, neither here nor there. You can be the judge. We talk about some of the topics that Judah could potentially discuss at the upcoming Verbal Behavior Conference, which, by the way, you should totally check out because it's an awesome event. The links to the conference are in the show notes for this episode. We talk about whether it's appropriate to teach problem-solving skills based on the learner profiles. We talk about improvisation, the development of rules and the importance of rules, and the challenges of studying problem-solving, because let's be honest, these are mostly private events that we're talking about here. So, boy, if you really like the application of behavioral principles to things that we don't talk about all that much, again, this is the podcast for you. I hope you really enjoy it. Before we get to this episode, I want to let you know that we're brought to you by CEUs from yours truly, Behavioral Observations. That's right, get CEUs while driving in the car, maybe even for this episode. Get CEUs while walking the dog, doing the dishes, or whatever else you might have going on, all while learning from your favorite podcast guests. Go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to learn more. We're also brought to you by the aforementioned Behavioral Toolbox. We just put out our new course, Motivational Interviewing. We've also been getting great feedback on when not to FBA. And we have another course called Ready, Set, Consult. So if you're working in schools, and actually we've had some customers who don't work in schools who are nonetheless snapping up that motivational interviewing course because it really applies to all sorts of things that we do. So go to thebehavioraltoolbox.com and check it out. We're also brought to you by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their webinars, their on-demand trainings, their brand new RBT, or brand newly revised, RBT course. They have an 8-hour supervision course. So learn how you can save while you learn over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. And last but not least, there's a growing community of Patreon subscribers, and they get these episodes early. Not only that, they just get the conversation itself. They don't get to listen to these opening remarks. They don't get the ads, none of that stuff. They just get the conversation, not even the intro music. And they get it all early. So again, if you want to learn more about that, go to patreon.com/behavioral observations to learn how you can support the podcast with a very inexpensive Patreon subscription. All right, I think that's enough of opening remarks for this episode. So without any further delay, please enjoy this really fun and interesting conversation with Dr. Judah Axe.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Judah Axe, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Matt. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I think the last time we bumped into each other was probably ABAI in Boston, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. Yeah,
where they had a serious shortage in bartenders, I believe, at the where there was like about one of 10,000 people, it seemed like, trying to flag down and get the attention of the staff there, to no avail, at least for I don't think I was. I ended up walking away, but in frustration. But that's neither here nor there. That's not what we came to talk about. We came to talk about problem solving and your work in that area. I'm looking forward to getting into that because it's not something I've really put some, sorry to say this, put some thought to, excuse me. So I'm looking forward to learning about this topic that I haven't really delved into that much. Before we do that though, let's let the audience know a little bit more about your background and how you got into behavior analysis, and take us up to what you're doing these days.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And yeah, I always enjoy telling the backstory. Let's see. The summer before my last year of college, I was living at home and needed a job. And my mom had a friend, still has a friend who had a son with autism, who was 13 at the time, and pretty classic repetitive movements, and could talk but not have a conversation, was really fixated on the schedule of the day and needed a one-on-one aid for summer camp. And so I thought, I like kids, I like camp, didn't know about autism, and I worked with him each day. And he didn't like to be touched. If someone touched him, he'd say, "Stop tickle, please." And so he was interesting to work with, but on top of that, he had some savant skills where he had been doing music therapy, and the music therapist had been playing on the piano and singing with him and having him sing Elton John's Your Song. And the therapist wrote home to the mom and said, "Have Eitan sing Your Song." And he was sitting on the piano bench at home facing into the living room and started singing, and then turned around, started playing it, and just picked up playing piano just by watching. And he's now, I'm in some contact and see him once in a while. And he's around 40 years old and has for many years been playing piano and singing in preschools and nursing homes, which is really great. His mom bought him a video of how to make balloon animals, which he memorized and would make balloon animals for the other kids at camp, and did it all on his own. That was just pretty amazing. So I got back to college and looked up autism in the phone book, and found a program to work in for my last year of school. And then worked with a third grader in his home doing discrete trial teaching, and got to the end of college and didn't exactly have the direct plan in place. So I thought, hey, I like working with kids with autism, and took a full-time job in Connecticut, and kept learning as much as I could because I was new to this. I hadn't studied it. And the company I worked for sent me to a lot of workshops, and the one workshop, 2-day workshop, that blew me away and said, "This is the best way to teach communication skills to kids with autism and reduce challenge and behavior," was Vincent Carbone, and talked about verbal behavior and motivating operations. And so at the time I was living at home and ready to make a move and called up Vince Carbone and said, "Hey, I loved your workshop. Could I come work with you and learn more and do more?" And he said, "No, I'm not hiring anyone right now who doesn't have a master's degree." And I said, "Oh, darn." And he gave out a book at his workshop by Sundberg and Partington. And I thought, well, whoever they are, they must do the same kind of thing. So I called them up, and Mark Sundberg hired me. And so I moved across the country to work with him for about a year and a half, and learned a whole lot about verbal behavior and behavior analysis and motivating operations and lots of other things. And so spent about a year and a half. And I also, while I was in California, spent about a school year working with the Kegel Autism Center in Santa Barbara, which was a beautiful place, and got to learn the pivotal response teaching. And then applied to grad schools. And I had actually grown up middle school and high school in Columbus, Ohio. And when Mark Sundberg told me that Ohio State has a good program for behavior analysis, I said, that sounds great. And so went there and did my master's and PhD there with Bill Heward as my master's advisor and Diane Sonato as my PhD advisor. And then in 2008, after that, went straight to Simmons, and in my 17th year at Simmons, where I directed our special ed program for a while and worked in both special ed and behavior analysis. And then some years ago, switched over to behavior analysis full time and teach the master's and PhD programs.
Oh, that's a cool story. Now, did you ever go back to Mark Sundberg and thank him for having lower standards than Vince Carbone?
That's funny.
I'm kidding. If Dr. Sundberg, if you listen to this, I'm just joking around. It seems like that worked out pretty. It's one of those things like things work out for a reason, I suppose. So, yeah, that's a cool backstory. So you've been at Simmons for 17 years. Holy cow! I know the program's been around for a while, but if someone told me to take a stab at how many years it's been in existence, I probably would have erred on the underside. So, yeah, good for you. That's pretty cool.
Pretty amazing how time goes on. And the PhD started about 2005 and the master's, I think the late 90s or so. Yeah.
Now you've probably had a front row seat to the evolution of online instruction. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, because we started our fully online master's program in 2015. We started working on it, launched maybe 2016. And I designed 2 fully online courses with that. And so everybody said, with COVID that, whoa, you were way ahead of the game. So that's nice. Yeah. And then, so we have the fully online master's program. We have an on-ground master's program. And then our PhD program was on ground, but then with COVID, we put it fully online. So yeah, we do online PhD now, which is nice. Students from around the country. And yeah. It's with Boston and parking and traffic and things. Before COVID, I was even having a lot of students meet on Zoom anyway, just for, coming in for a 3-hour course is one thing, but coming in for a 1-hour research meeting isn't exactly economical or needed or, so we were doing things on Zoom already. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just down in Boston a few weeks ago, taking my middle kid on some college visits, and holy cow, I grew up in Massachusetts, visited Boston, for various reasons, but yeah, getting in and out of there and trying to park and all that stuff is just a nightmare. So yeah, good for you guys for, I guess geographically democratizing this important area of learning. So. All right, cool. So I appreciate you going through that, and sure there's probably a whole host of Ohio State stories that we could, spend a lot of time going, over, but I'll try to remain somewhat on task here and get down to business. So when you and I started talking about coming on the show, you threw out a couple of topics that you were keen to discuss, and one of them being problem solving, particularly with kids with autism, or people with autism, I should say. And it's not something that I have spent a lot of time, like as I said earlier, thinking about or what have you. And so, I was like, oh, all right, let's definitely do it. So one of the things I did is I looked up a paper that you and Phelan and Irwin published in 2018. If I recall correctly, it was more of a review paper on problem solving. And, so I found that a good, I guess, foundation, if you will. One of the things that struck me initially in the paper was different types of conceptualizations of what constitutes a problem. Some of them offered by Skinner, some of them offered subsequently by Donahue and Palmer. Can you talk about, that? Because I thought that was an interesting way to frame it or begin the discussion on what is a problem, and obviously, by extension, what is problem solving. So if you can give us that kind of foundation, I think that would be fun to get that as a jumping off point.
Yeah. So And sometimes it's hard because, like a lot of terms in behavior analysis, they mean different things depending on the author, depending on the context. But Skinner defined a problem as an antecedent, whether that be a little MO flavor, SD flavor, that kind of in not his terms, but would evoke a behavior, but the behavior is not immediately available. The response, the type of response is in the person's repertoire. So it's not something totally that they've never ever done before, but they've done parts of it or pieces of it. And so an antecedent situation that would evoke response but doesn't immediately, or to use Skinner's terms, I'll quote for a second, in the true problem situation, the organism has no behavior immediately available, which will reduce the deprivation or provide escape from aversive stimulation. So that last part implying there's an MO in place, right? That type of MO has evoked behavior in the past, but it's not currently evoking behavior. So that's a problem. And that's definition of a problem. And I've got some examples if you'll play along with me for a minute, and people can play while they're listening too. So let's see. Ready, Matt?
Wait a second. I asked the questions here. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Yeah. Here's a few questions. And you, yeah. Okay. And yeah, usually this is the audience where it's low stakes, but anyway, what is 49 plus 37?
Oh, geez, Louise. I'm going to have to edit this. All right. Well, given the amount of time it took me to actually answer this question, I figured this would be a good place to put in our first ad and let you know that, if you're looking for CEUs, we have a lot of bundle packages, discounts, if you will, for buying more than one CEU event over at behavioralobservations.com. And I was just crunching the numbers, and the average discount savings in the past year has been almost $100. So if you are in need of more than one, let's say you procrastinated a little bit, go to behavioralobservations.com and see if we have any events that pique your interest. And chances are, if you listen to this podcast, we certainly do. So you can, whether you need a lot or just a couple, you can go over there. And again, as I mentioned at the introduction of this episode, you can learn while you drive, learn while you walk the dog, while you're at the gym, et cetera, et cetera. You can take care of some or a lot of your CEU needs over at behavioralobservations.com. Go over there and check it out right away. All right, let's get back to my answer to this impromptu math problem. Thanks, Judah. 49 plus 37, that would be 86?
Yeah, 86,
okay.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
So
I'm going to mop my brow after that one.
I know. Sorry, that I think that's my hardest question.
Okay, good.
Actually, it's not. But anyway. So it looked like when I asked that question, you didn't immediately say 86, right? If I said, what's 2 plus 2?
4.
You'd immediately say 4. No thinking involved, right? So if I may ask, what did you do? Actually, let me come back to the what did you do part. So another question, another problem is, and this is tricky with a podcast, but I'll say, what was 3 days ago? So, and this comes from Palmer, this kind of example, but today for us is Wednesday. And so 3 days ago was Tuesday, Monday, Sunday. So what did you have for dinner on Sunday? And it's okay if you don't remember.
I don't remember.
Okay, yeah.
I don't remember. I know I went to pub trivia later, and I know I ate before I left.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I know what I drank at pub trivia, but that's a whole nother podcast, I guess.
Yeah. And you don't obviously have to answer this one either, but you could. But so I actually this past weekend went with my wife. We got away from our, sounds bad, but 11 and 8-year-olds for the first time for a whole weekend.
Awesome.
Which
Good for
was
you.
Wonderful. And we went up to your state in Franconia, New Hampshire, and did some hiking, and it was nice. And if we were I guess while we were planning this trip, I might have asked my wife, how long does it take to drive to Franconia from Boston? And do you happen to know how long it takes to drive from Boston to Franconia?
I would probably say like 2.5 hours, just
Yeah.
maybe 3, depending on traffic.
And we might have asked, what's the weather going to be like this weekend in Franconia? What's the temperature going to be, right? And so you can answer that if you and I were planning a trip, right? And one other type of problem that actually I haven't brought up in these kind of talks about problem solving, but you have a 10-year-old child who doesn't talk. That's a problem, right? Do we know immediately how to fix that? No. Or we have a 15-year-old child who engages in self-injurious behavior. That's a problem that takes some doing to, not an immediate response on the part of the behavior analyst to treat that or reduce that, right? So those are some examples of problems. And then problem solving is engaging in some behaviors that produce the target response or produce SDs that evoke the target response. And from Skinner, and these are from Science and Human Behavior, problem solving may be defined as any behavior which, through the manipulation of variables, makes the appearance of a solution more probable. And I like to think of the manipulation of variables as moving things around and behaving and trying things out, working things out, lots of ways to do that. And Donahoe and Palmer, the behavior of supplementing or manipulating discriminative stimuli until a particular response in the organism's repertoire becomes prepotent over many other responses that are changing the probability. So again, moving things around, supplementing, manipulating SDs. And one other definition, problem solving and problems, Skinner, and also come up in things like direct instruction, Morningside and Engelman and Carnine, and an example or a definition from Becker, Engelman, and Thomas, tasks that demand a novel, which is to say, untrained synthesis or combination of responses in the presence of a novel stimulus. All right. So those are some definitions. So if we go back to the math problem, what did you do between when I said what's 49 plus 37 between that and you saying 86?
Well, I tried doing the actual kind of calculation, and then I quickly abandoned that and rounded and, adjusted from there, figuring that was the easier way to
49 to 50.
Exactly. And then added 37 to 50 and subtract. Yeah. And so I, between that and, there's probably some panic in there somewhere about like doing math on the spot that's recorded. That's, only a couple of thousand people are going to hear this. So, no pressure.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's good. It's good. It's all good.
And so, and where did you do all that?
Oh, it was all private. It was covertly. Yeah. So
in your head. Yeah. So, and Skinner interpreted doing things like that covertly as behaving, right? So you were engaging in covert behavior to, let's see, I'm going to round the 37 to 40, or sorry, 49 to 50, and so on. And so you went through that and kind of talked to yourself a little bit in your head. Well, if 50 plus 37 is that, then I subtract 1, and talking to yourself covertly. And when I asked what you ate for dinner this past Sunday, even though you didn't exactly get there, what did you do to try to get there?
I thought backwards through what I had last night, the night before, etc.
Yeah. So you were also self-talking a little bit. Did you see anything while you were doing that?
Yes.
What did you see?
Well, I mean, I was just trying to like place myself in the kitchen of my house where I would have prepared the dinner. So because I was solo parent all weekend long, so I spent a lot of time in the kitchen preparing things, and so I excuse me, yeah. So I was just trying to like visualize myself in the kitchen and what I might have pulled out of the fridge to make or something like that. But
Yep. So you saw the kitchen, you saw the fridge. Exactly. Yeah. And you also, yeah, self-talk of what did I have yesterday? What did I have the day before? And went through that. Sometimes when I play along with that or other people, you see your calendar and think, and it sounds like you saw the pub and the beer you had and trying to, what came right before that. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Neat. And of course, if the geography questions, we could use apps, the weather app, the maps app to answer those kind of things. And of course, with Kids Who Don't Talk or engage in SIB, we go through a whole host of assessments to come up with and maybe brainstorm some treatments or interventions and then choose one to work on with kids to try to change those behaviors in some way. So yeah, those are some definitions and examples. Thanks for playing along. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's all good. It's all good. I just want to take a quick break here. I know I mentioned Behavior University at the top of the podcast, and I'm usually talking about their revised RBT course, which they're getting just amazing reviews on. But I want to draw your attention to their live webinars. And you've probably heard me talk about this in the past also. These things are super popular, and there's not unlimited seats. These things sell out. So, for example, on Thursday, December 5th, Centering Autistic Perspectives in Early Childhood Services, sold out. Sounds interesting. So you got to go to Behavior University and sign up for these. Just jump on it. Carve out that time in your calendar to learn more about these fascinating topics. Here are some ones that you can jump in on as of the time of this recording. Supervision Essentials, Practical Feedback and Problem-Solving Strategies. That's coming up in December, Friday the 13th. Oh, look at that, December 13th. And then we got another one, A Compassionate Approach to Understanding and Addressing Interfering Behaviors. And that's by Dr. Celia Heyman. That is coming up on Friday, January 10th. And there's ones that I'm looking at here on the page. Supervision, Gerontology and Neurocognitive Disorders. That's coming up in February. That sounds fascinating. Anxiety and ABA. We have something for that. That's by a fan favorite, Steve Ward. That's coming up on February 8th. And there are a lot more. So you're going to want to go to behavioruniversity.com and check out their live webinars. And if you're there shopping for CEUs, use the promo code podcast to save at checkout. And you can also just go to the show notes to this episode to learn more. All right, let's get back to the rest of this interview. So what do we know? I don't have a particularly strong background in developmental psychology. If you went to Auburn in the 90s, it's one of those, if you know types of things. At the developmental psych class at that vintage of grad student at the time, the teacher at the time just chose to teach a philosophy of science class instead, called it developmental. So it's a lot.
Right.
Anyway, like there's like 5 people who will hear and know what I'm talking about. But as such, I don't know when these things typically develop in, I guess, typically develop populations and things like that. So do you have a sense in terms of along like a normal developmental trajectory where children start to be able to do some of this self-talk and solve what I would guess to be at the beginning simple, kind of problems and then working up to more complex ones?
Yeah, I don't have an amazing answer. I didn't study developmental psych. I actually told my professors at Ohio State that I thought we should be required to take a developmental psych class for these types of reasons. But what I can say is that it must be the case, right? That typical kids, typical development, you learn some repertoires, then you start combining repertoires, synthesizing, behaviors. And one way to think about it is Bloom's Taxonomy. And I've brought that up with problem solving in the past, that's a model of for education and different types of learning, right? So there's 6 levels of it, and the lowest level, or which is the most basic, is depending, there's lots of ways people talk about this, but remembering or recalling facts, defining things, memorizing, repeating, stating, right? So, think of a typical kid, and just like we do with tech training, you might hold up a toy truck, what is it? Truck, right? So kind of straight tacting is that first level. or even, what is a truck? It's a vehicle that carries stuff, right? And then a second level of understanding, which would be describing, identifying, recognizing, selecting, translating. So a little bit higher, but still pretty much a 1-for-1 relation. And yeah. And then third level is apply. And I think of this as often what we want in terms of generalization when we teach skills to kids. And so this is using information in new situations. Solving is one term that goes along with that. So getting towards problem solving, using, demonstrating. Yeah. But then when we get higher than that, I think we're definitely getting into problem solving, because we have analyze, which is differentiate or organize, compare, contrast, experiment, things like that. The next level being evaluating, of appraising, judging, value, critique, and the final level to create, to assemble, develop, formulate, investigate, write something new, that sort of thing. I think as I go through that too, yeah, we could say a little bit that's some structural definitions, and often think of Palmer as giving us more functional definitions, in that if at any of those levels there's a history of reinforcement. So, maybe I've never defined a truck before. And so I've got to visualize a truck and say, well, what does a truck do? And ask myself and stuff. But if I've been asked to describe a truck 30 times and gotten feedback for it, then it's kind of like 2 + 2, it just comes. And so I think the Bloom's taxonomy gives a framework, but also more meaningful is when there's problem solving, often when there's not a history of reinforcement for a certain response. And so you've got to self-question and visualize to come up with an answer. A couple other ways of thinking about it from typical kids, if you look up problem solving and development, sometimes it's the steps of it are stating a problem clearly, come up with possible solutions, like brainstorming, choose what seems like the best solution, try out the solution, and review how it worked and make changes if necessary. So that might be, development, or what preschool teachers might start to do with kids. And I think one last piece of it is there's development, but it's also lifelong learning, right? I'm still learning to solve problems in my life in certain ways, or in my work. And so I think it's lifelong in a way that it develops with more and more complex problems, or different types of problems, or that sort of thing. Yeah.
There's a lot to think about there. One of the things that I was wondering about, you mentioned, with the going back to the math example where, 2 + 2 is is an automatic response, if you will. And this is a drum I've been kind of banging on for a while, just in my day-to-day work as a educational consultant, behavioral consultant in schools. And is this, with the role of fluency in, kind of lower level skills that make solving more complex problems easier to do. I don't know if that's something that you've uncovered in your scholarship in this area, but, there's almost an epidemic level of kids not knowing their math facts. And it's just like kind of alarming to me that how many kids just don't, I'm talking like 5th, 6th, 7th graders and beyond, And if we're expecting these students to, do word problems and, go into things like trigonometry and calculus and things, stats or what have you, the if we just think about the number of problems to be solved, we've just, forgive the term, I don't mean it purposely here, but we've multiplied the number of problems to be solved by ignoring the getting the simpler steps to some level of automaticity. So I'm not sure if there's a question in there or this is just an editorial comment on my part. But again, is that something that you've uncovered or thought about in your research in this area?
Well, the first thing I think about is more my 5th and 3rd grade, biological kids, my own daughters, and watching, seeing what they do in math and this shift that math has taken where, you and I and people of our age or older, memorized our multiplication tables, right? And we drilled those and we got those solid. And I think this new approach to math, and actually I have this quote that Nancy Neef, who published a couple studies on problem solving, put in one of her papers. This is from some educator from 2001, that we want to see a shift from a behaviorist approach of teaching rote learning of facts and procedures to a constructivist approach, right? And so I think it's in part same with reading and fluency versus whole language, the wars that go on, and I think it seems with math that this more conceptual learning of numbers rather than rote memorization and rather than learning the algorithms for things like carrying the one. Kids don't learn that anymore. And yeah, supposedly it helps them comprehend numbers and, mathematical concepts later on. But I think it way slows down the solving of problems. And I think if we think of that or other types of problems, the more we're fluent with the components, then and we've had exposure to multiple exemplars of different types of problems, then we just have more tools in our toolbox to quickly choose from and solve new problems. Yeah. So I think fluency is a big part of it, important part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have heard people push back on my advocacy for this by saying, well, they can always, everyone's always going to have a calculator available. And I'm like, what planet do you live on? It's like if you're in a store and you need to, you see something that's on sale and you need to, just quickly estimate like what the price is and stuff like that. Anyway, I'll stop. This is kind of like, I feel like the, one of the old men in the balcony at the Muppets. Yeah. So but anyway, I've got more questions on problem solving, but I want to take an intentional pause here because I want to bring up a very special event that you'll be talking and speaking at, very likely both, coming up, and that is the Verbal Behavior Conference. So and one of the things that's cool about the Verbal Behavior Conference is that, well, there's a number of things, but it is that if you really dig what a speaker is talking about, you get to see them twice. So I know you'll, at least I believe the format is the same as it has been in previous years, where the speakers give a talk on day one and they either give another talk or they go into more depth about, the same topic on day two. And if you're there, and actually virtually too, I would say, excuse me, there's lots and lots of opportunities for direct interaction with the speakers, particularly if you're there. So if you can get on site with us in Austin, that would be really, it blows my mind how accessible all the speakers are to the people there on site, to the point of having lunch with them or, and things like that. It's really quite remarkable. And I don't think there's anything quite as intimate as that in our, kind of conference circuit. So having said all that, what do you plan to be talking about at this year's, the 2025 Verbal Behavior Conference?
Yeah. And just to put a fine point on that too, the single track nature of it is really nice for everybody's in the same room the whole time. And yeah, that it's all verbal behavior. I spoke at, I believe it was 2018, and I had seen several talks and then got it up for mine. And I said, man, this is like drinking from the fire hose of verbal behavior, and so it's super rich and all the new research and thinking that's coming out. So it is a exciting conference. So in all truth, the conference hasn't asked me what I'm speaking about. So I actually maybe have three possibilities, and simply one would be problem solving. And I gave a talk on that, back in 2018, will have been 7 years ago. And since then I've conducted several more studies. I have about 5 studies worked on with my doc students on problem solving. So giving, updates on that and going through some of our more recent research could be one topic. Another topic that I started working on with my doc students somewhat during COVID when we couldn't conduct studies. And so we started working on a big review paper on MOs and man training. And particularly with Dr. Sarah Frampton at the helm of leading this work, and a few of us working on it together. And so that came out during that time, 2 recent papers in BAP and a dissertation that we're working on writing up. And the general themes are an updated, because there have been a couple in past decades, review of what do we know about methods to capture and contrive MOs to teach MANs to kids with autism. And also this, I think, exciting development of something we've known, but we try to really give a name to and define and conceptualize, which is an indicating response, which is something, less verbal, not using a word or a sign or a picture, but some other indicator that there's EO for some reinforcer. So pointing at an item, looking at an item, reaching for an item. And so that, and then one of my students did a study on teaching MANs and specifically using the quick transfer of stimulus control procedure. And so I think, it's something we've known about for a lot in general, MOs and man training, but I still think there's a lot more we can learn to make it more efficient and effective and functional. So so that's another topic. And then the third one is something been working on, which is, trying to get, I guess, similar problem solving, but continue to move us out of the roteness and out of context type learning that happens with discrete trials teaching, and move things toward being more meaningful, more usable in natural environments. And so that's another topic.
Yeah, that sounds like a home run for sure in terms of interest, and very I guess timely with all the discussions that are going on in the field about behavior analysis place in the world of I guess the bigger picture of autism treatment. So lots of very cool potential topics, and so I look forward to hearing them. And just for folks who are interested in learning more about the Verbal Behavior Conference, you can go to behaviorlive.com and just plug in the search Verbal Behavior Conference. You can Google Verbal Behavior Conference. You can go to the show notes for this episode. I'll have a link for it there. It's probably the easiest way to do it. And just to, I guess, round out the promo here is that it's going to be on March 27th through 28th in 2025, both online and in lovely Austin, Texas. There's a pre-conference workshop that's going to be provided by Dr. Barbara Esch. And the other presenters include Drs. Pat McGreevy, Tiffany Kodak, of course, yourself, Judah, Dr. April Kizamore-Hunter, Barb Esch, Cal Miguel as well. So, boy, if you like this stuff, you're in for a treat. And at the end of the first day, we always do a kind of a wrap-up panel discussion, which I get the privilege to moderate, and that's always great fun. Have all the panelists kind of mix it up over the various topics, and I just get to stand back and watch you guys do it. So The verbal behavior concept is a lot of fun, so check it out. All right, so back to problem solving. So if I'm a clinician, either working at homes or in a clinic or working with kids in the school program, and I'm plugging along at one of the in one of the established ABA curricula out there that maybe doesn't necessarily program for this sort of thing, how would I know if my student would benefit from this type of training? We can get into how to, I guess, teach it, I suppose. That's obviously super important, but I guess at a more fundamental level, how do we assess the need for this type of training? Especially in the context of situations where we see this all the time, particularly for individuals with more severe intellectual disabilities, where people are trying to train things that are too complicated and not focusing on, foundational skills, adaptive skills, functional skills, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess on the one hand, talking about problem solving is awesome because it's an opportunity for us to, kind of stretch beyond some, just simple rote learning and things like that. At the same time, there might be a risk of people saying, "Oh, problem solving, awesome," but my student, still needs help, toilet training or doing improv, has other, more fundamental challenges to overcome and things like that. So where do you assess and where do you place this all in the hierarchy of, I guess, priority of training, especially in the context of, limited time and resources and things like that?
Yeah, it's a complex question. And yeah, I've been attending a lot to Peter Gerhardt, and his message is that some of the adaptive skills, if kids don't have those, but they have lots of language skills that they can do, how independent are they going to be once they get to adulthood? And I think that those are types of questions for the field to keep grappling with. So I think one way to think of it is that the main skills that often come up with, as you say, kids with more severe learning challenges and types of skills in the VB map or other types of assessments are often, especially in the level 1 type skills, a 1-for-1 relation. So there's an MO, there's a response as a man, right? You show a picture, there's a response as a tact. Introverbals, simple introverbals are often a 1-for-1 relation. You wear shoes and child says socks, and imitation and the coex and things like that. And I think that an individual should have a developed repertoires in those areas, should have many of those. We're talking level 2, level 3 on the VB map, 100 tacks, 50 mans, whatever it might be. And some examples that I have about types of things that you might know that you'd need to, that problem solving might be right to start working on. I mean, I worked with a little girl. One of the first little girls that I worked with way back when was 2.5 at the time, got the diagnosis. And the parents at first said she got a diagnosis largely because she's not pointing. Will you teach her how to point? And I was very new, and I had never been taught how to do that, but she liked all these toys and like a farm with different animals. And so I could tell when she wanted something, I would just physically mush her hand into a point and have her point and then give her the item. And she started pointing a bit. But she would also, there was a time when she came into our clinic and came in, stood at the door and saw other kids and adults and just started jumping up and down and smiling, right? So presumably there was an EO for playing, engaging with other kids and adults, but she didn't have the repertoire of what to do next, right? And so I think with social skills, there are a ton of possibilities and not much research on it, but the the one study that is quite from a long time ago, 1989, by Park and Gaylord Ross, worked through this system with adolescents, where they taught them these 7 rules of what's happening, and then what are 3 things I could do, right? That little girl, I could keep smiling and jumping here. I could go over to one of the adults, or I could go over to one of the kids. And what might happen if I did each one? Which one's better? Pick, do it, and evaluate how it went. And it's kind of teaching that sort of list of self-talk to go through that would then evoke a response out of the person. And so that might be an indicator, right? That you need some teaching some self-talk in that way could be beneficial. A couple other situations, I mean, phonics and phonemic learning with reading is really great example, and an obvious, maybe just like math example of problem solving that, I've read D, and I've read deuce, and then I'm shown deduce, and I can read that because I'm synthesizing those prior repertoires, right? Something like that. Math. And oh yeah, the one other one is that, and there's a great study on this actually, yeah, by Nancy Neef also, is that if, say, a child has a good amount of mans, 30 mans or something, and particularly a child who uses pictures or a device, and they see a new toy that they're really interested in, but they don't have an icon for that, right? And what do? Right? And so in this study, they taught the kids to use some of the icons and combine them in a new way to, approximate what demand would be. And so there's some old examples in there, but one example is, say that they figure out that a CD, plays this music that they really love. They don't have an icon for CD, but they have an icon for the color silver, and they have an icon for circle. So they could say, something like, I want silver circle. And that would be a problem solving technique to synthesize. They called it improvising, prior repertoires with this new novel situation. And so, yeah, doing things like that, so that, what do I do if I want something but I don't have the icon for it, and teaching them to improvise, synthesize is a pretty nifty technique.
That's a really cool example.
Regardless of your title, if you are a behavior consultant who is working in or with schools and you are struggling and wondering why your interventions are not producing the desired results, you are not alone. Unfortunately, those tasked with improving behavior in schools are too often left to carry the burden by themselves. You are the behavior person, so you take care of it, is the unsaid mantra. But you can't improve behavior and the associated outcomes by yourself. In fact, creating sustainable improvement in student behavior almost always requires changes in the performance of the educators. I'm Dr. Pauly, and along with my colleagues Anika Costa and Matt Sikoria, we are designing coursework called the Behavioral Toolbox. In it, you will be taught strategies grounded in organizational behavior management for consulting in schools in a way that brings out the best in educators so they can bring out the best in the students they serve. If this sounds exciting, be sure to click on the link in the description to sign up for more information.
I guess one of the things that struck me as I was thinking through this topic is the challenges associated with trying to experimentally analyze these things that, the events are private, right? They're covert. And so can you talk about the challenges about, that come from trying to, do some good empirical research on things that we don't have access to as it relates to measurement?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely challenging. And, I always feel a little tension or a little queasiness when we start it's because he's visual imagining, that's why it's happening, and it's like, wait, we don't know this,
Right.
so we have to keep being parsimonious and skeptical. And I lately, I've had a few instances of, pulling some students back from, let's not try to make visual imagining the only independent variable, right? It's got to be some procedure that the clinician therapist does that involves visual imagining, but we can't say for sure, but yeah, things like that. So visual imagining in particular is I think one of the harder ones to work with. But there are some ways that I and other researchers have tried to control for covert behavior. And two by some prior researchers. So there's a couple of the just as an aside, I guess, or the way I got into studying this was, well, I was a fan of Dave Palmer for sure from early on and going to conferences. And I was asked a few years into my time at Simmons to do a guest lecture on Palmer's paper on memory and problem solving. And so I studied up on that a bunch and got interested. And then I was curious, has anybody conducted studies using any of this? And I found a couple early ones from Western Michigan University. Kazimore, actually, who's speaking at the conference, her study on visual imagining to teach interverbal categorization, kind of like, tell me some animals. And another student, Rachel Sauter, who was there at the same time, and her thesis, which was using self rules to do a similar, tell me some animals, tell me some vehicles. And one time around that time I saw Palmer and I said, with respect to the review paper that we wrote, was I'm working on looking at applied studies on problem solving. And he said, what applied studies? He hadn't attended to that at the time, right? It was all still theoretical, conceptual to him, and I don't think yet had realized that people were really taking this and publishing things in Java, looking at these skills. And there was a precedent decades prior of playing with some of the ideas also. But in the Kaizen or the Western Michigan papers, which are also both advised by Jim Carr and Linda LeBlanc, they had two nifty ways to try to get some evidence of covert behavior. One of them was with the self rules. So, for example, tell me some animals, and they would say, well, my first rule is think of a category, and there's ocean animals, and then think of some types of ocean animals. Or sorry, think of the group, think of some types. There's ocean animals, land animals, air animals, and pick one. So I want to pick ocean. What are they? And they talked overtly about these things. And they collected data on how much they said and saw that over time it gradually reduced. And so don't know that it went to the covert level, but that's some evidence that it went from overt to covert, right? Because they were still producing correct answers. And the other one, and one of my students and I extended the visual imagining part of this. They had to use typical kids, and we did this with kids with autism. And so that's the general idea. And with visual imagining, it's imagine ocean animals and then say those, then imagine land animals and say those, or farm animals, I should say. And then imagine zoo animals or whatever the categories are. And that was the strategy. And some evidence of using the strategy, even if it was, you couldn't hear anything, was that they would group the responses, right? So it'd say, see the ocean animals, and it'd say lobster, fish, crab, and shark, right? And then see the farm animals, and they'd say cow, pig, chicken, goat. And they graphed the order in which they said them and showed that they grouped them. Ocean animals, then they said farm animals, then they said zoo animals, and the order wasn't the same every time. So it wasn't a rote response and it wasn't random, but that lent some evidence to the covert problem solving. That was really neat. Another way to control for it is using blocking. So we did one study that it was about recall memory. It wasn't exactly about problem solving, but it was looking at if there's a situation that you're in and then you're asked about it later on, what do you remember from that situation? And the strategy was to teach the kids to tact things in the situation, right? So, or as they were seeing pictures, they would tact like goat, zebra, couch, and that was the independent variable. And we saw that generally when we had them tact, they recalled more items than if they didn't tact. But if we keep on doing the sessions, they might covertly tact, right, in the non-tacting condition. So we used a blocking procedure where at one point in the situation when they were looking at pictures, we had them repeat random numbers and letters. Q, B, 2, 9, 4, 6, Z, P, R, with the idea that if they're doing that, they cannot tact to the pictures. And we saw that in many cases that lowered the amount that they recalled when asked later on. So those are some ways to address covert behavior. One final way I'll say that I haven't worked on, but I've seen a couple of presentations on and articles is the Morningside TAPS program, Talk Aloud protocol. And the idea there is that you just talk through everything that you do so that if you didn't talk, you might, the idea is that when people are not talking and talking it through, what they're doing when they're not talking is what they do when they do talk it through. And so that gives some evidence of the type of covert problem solving. And I just recently looked that up, the Talk Aloud, and it's actually used outside of behavior analysis in software usability testing. So it's right, you're going around a software or website and clicking around and the creators have people talk out loud what they're thinking, what they're doing while they're going around so they can get information on the thinking process and which can help make changes and improvements to the software. So,
wow, those are a couple of real helpful examples to conceptualize this. So one of the things, especially the think, I could totally see how that think aloud piece in the terms of software development would enhance user experience for sure. So that's really interesting. As someone who maintains 2 websites, that's it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So how do we not confuse people who are trying to get information from your sites? For sure. In the review paper, you use this term precurrent repertoire. Can you define that, and how does that relate to this general topic?
Yeah. It's, as far as I can tell, another case of Skinner using terms that I'm not sure if they were his own or if he borrowed them from somewhere else, but they're certainly not used in everyday, talking. But it's simply that the current response is the one targeted for reinforcement. So like in the math problem I gave you, 86 was the current behavior. And then what you did in your head in between the question and the response is the precurrent behavior. So I often use it as synonym with problem solving behavior is the same as precurrent behavior. Some people also use the term mediating behavior. Yeah, I like the term problem solving behavior because it, I don't know, keeps it with the main terminology. But yeah, Skinner referred to that as precurrent behavior.
Got it. Yeah, I think I like the problem solving. I mean, it's just less jargony, I suppose, and more accessible to, what we might consider normal people. So
yeah, exactly.
So we have a lot of students listening to the show. And so if I'm a grad student and I'm looking for a research topic, what are some good experimental questions that are still hanging around out there? I'm sure there are, probably limitless, of course, but, especially at like the master's level, not some magnum opus or something like that, but something doable, what, from your perspective, particularly as someone who has grad students and is in academia and does research, if someone came to you as a master's student and said, "Hey, look, I really like this problem solving topic. What are, what are some good directions in terms of finding a good research idea or question to really dig into for my grad work?"
Yeah. There are, like you say, there are many, right? Endless, perhaps, but I'll name a few that I think are top of my priority list. I think what I talked about before, that Park and Gaylord Ross process in approaching social skills with teaching those self rules of what's happening, what are three things I could do, what would happen if I did each, choose one, do it, evaluate how it goes. That's a little repertoire that and I think many typically developing adults do instantaneously, right? You get to, I mean, I know we only spend all our time at conferences, right? But you get to a conference or you get to a party or something, and you see, oh, there's that guy. I'd love to talk to him, and oh, but he looks pretty busy right now and has a lot of people trying to talk to him. And there's that colleague, and she's sitting alone over there, so I could go up to her, and maybe one other thing, and then we choose which one we're going to do. I could stand here and look like you know, look alone. And so and what would happen if I did each one, and then we choose one, and it might flop, and we're like, I'm never doing that again,
Right,
but
right.
we go through that, in an instant. So trying to teach out that social repertoire, I think, would be really beneficial to a lot of kids, particularly adolescents, say. A shout out to Amanda Karsten, Charlotte Mann, who have a 2020 Java study on conversation skills with college age autistic people, and, things like being able to try to identify, I'm talking about something. Is the person look bored? Do they look interested for me to keep going? And trying to respond to that. Those sorts of like real everyday conversation, social skills, things that a lot of, slightly higher functioning autistic adolescents and adults really want to learn how to do, I think would be really beneficial. It was a little shout out to the National Autism Conference that happens every August it's been mostly at Penn State. It was in Harrisburg this past year. And I saw Andrew Kita talk about that TAPS, Talk Aloud protocol from Morningside. And I think it has a lot of potential of asking students to talk out loud with what they're doing, to try to gain information on the word they use is how they rationalize, their thinking process, their approach, their strategy, and trying to combine some of what we might say Skinner's analysis of problem solving with some of the Morningside TAPS model. Is how could we put those two things together? Yeah. And that just makes me think of one other pet topic that I have these days is when Mark Sundberg and some others developed the verbal behavior approach and the ABLES and the VB map, and it was very much about purity in the verbal operants, right? If it's intraverbal, it better not evolve in echoic, and if it's a man, there's no questions beforehand, and it's going towards purity. And some researchers and some movements are pushing in the direction of that's, I think, sometimes the right approach, but also is we want multiply controlled. We want to, because it can help a lot, right? It's kind of the problem solving strategy. If I echo with, say, an intraverbal, that can give me some time to come up with a response, say that sort of thing. So yeah, I won't go on about that, but yeah, the TAPS model, the okay, I'll share a little story. The that Yeah, from the ABAI conference, there was a wonderful panel on private events. It was a bunch of years back with 4 leaders in private events were David Palmer, Jay Moore, Bill Baum, and I always blank on his name. The third guy. Oh, Mitch Freiling. And it was a packed room, and I was sitting in the back, and it was kind of like 2 against 2, right? Palmer and Moore were on the Skinnerian, radical behaviorism side, and Baum especially is the methodological behaviorist. There's no place for private events in behavior analysis and covert behavior. And I'm sitting in the back row for some reason, and I see a guy in a red shirt come in holding a clipboard, and red shirt means I'm an employee or volunteer with the conference, and he's pointing just about at each person in the room and moving his lips, and then he wrote something down on his piece of paper, and I said, oh, he's counting the people in the room to get a sense of how many people attended this session. And I'm thinking to myself, as I'm hearing Baum say that there's no room for private events, that person could not count the people in the room without being disruptive if he did it out loud, unless he engaged in covert counting, right? And so after the panel, I went up to my friend and I said, I'd love to go tell Baum that idea and see what he says. And my friend said, you should do it. And so I went up and I said to him, I told him that situation, and he said, you don't need, okay, sorry, to drill into it a little bit more. It's if the person wrote 397 on the piece of paper, right? What is the SD? What is the immediate antecedent that evokes 397, right? And I would say that it's the product of the verbal response that comes right after pointing to the last person in the room that they count, right? They've made it through all the heads, and they point to the last person and they say 396, and then they say 397, and the product of that covert response is the SD that evokes me writing 397 on the piece of paper, right? And so I laid that out for Baum, and he said, no, you don't need any of that. I said, what evokes writing the number? And he said, it's just the people. It's just the people in the room. That's the stimulus. That's the SD. Like, no, that can't be. You couldn't just look at the group of people and write 397, right? You have to go through that process.
It's like those guess the jelly bean contests, right?
Exactly. The trick of those, because I did one of those recently and I guessed really well and got a prize, but you can't see behind them, right? If it's in the jar. But anyway, yes, it is like that. And so since then, I've thought that there must be skills that autistic kids, adolescents, adults should learn that require covert verbal behavior, right? Whether it's solving a math problem in your head or counting things or, going through a recipe or something like that. And so I would love to see more research on, teaching, problem solving process at the overt level, and then directly teaching kids to bring it to the covert level to solve new problems. So that's another area. And a final one I'll say is, I asked you about how long does it take to drive from Boston to Franconia. So we did a study with teaching adolescents with autism to use apps to answer those types of questions. So it was a problem because we always gave new cities. They had never been reinforced for how long does it take to drive to X city before? And what's the weather in X city and what's the time? And we taught them to, use an app and go to the app and type it in and get the answer. And I'd love to see more research on that with, that's a little bit academic. It was a worksheet that we did, maybe a geography lesson, but there could be much more planning for going to the movies. What movie are playing? What times are the movies? What restaurants could we go to? When's the bus come? And some more functional life skills, things like that we all use apps for all the time, and that we could teach adolescents, say with autism, or adults to use.
I hadn't planned to ask this, but it occurred to me as we were chatting here. I have 3 children, and they all have their driver's licenses now. My youngest is a bit of an anomaly. I refer to him as Rand McNally because he just kind of intuits his way around and unlike the other 2, pays attention to, like, when we're driving from point A to point B and actually knows how to get around places and, can read signs and whatnot. The older 2 are clueless because they I don't know how my youngest escaped this, but, they're in the age of, Google Maps, Apple Maps, et cetera, and, and it's like, why should I bother, and I'm not harping on those apps specifically, but I wonder, with the readily available information that is in everyone's pocket.
Yeah.
Are we losing, much like my concern about math fact fluency.
Yeah.
Are we losing problem solving repertoires because information is so readily available, right now? And that just may be more of a comment than a question. I don't know how you get at that or anything like that, but and I'll put all 3 of my kids in the same category. Sometimes they'll ask me something that's a Googleable question, or that is something that is, that could be found out through other means. And I just happen to be, the Google of the moment because I'm standing there in the same room or whatever. And I often say things like, "Oh, why don't you first pretend I'm not here?" If you had to solve this problem without me, like, well, how would you go about it? And stuff like that. So I do kind of push back when I think to do it, but just, as a parent, and again, this is not a kids these days thing. This is just, they're behaving in the environment in which, they're, I don't know. How do you think about that sort of thing? I'm curious if you have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I do. I mean, first of all, with autistic adolescents or adults, let's give them the apps, let's give them the tools, and so I think your comment's not totally applicable to them. That's the tools will certainly help them. With other individuals, I totally agree. So we could say it's a problem of, how do I get to the mall? And so I type, and I don't know how. So I type it into the GPS or the map app, and it takes me right there. And so using the app is problem solving. But then what happens if your phone dies, right? And you don't have a charger, right?
Yeah. Do you live in my house? Because I've asked them that same question.
Exactly. Yeah. And so now we've got a new type of problem, right? And a different repertoire of problem solving that needs to come to strength. And so, yeah, I don't know, I'm with you in general. I think it's the outside of my work exactly, but my kids are 11 and 8, and my wife and I are fully aligned that we want to, delay phones as much as possible. I mean, that gets into, the different issue of social media, which I think is outside what we're talking about, but also, and also being able to talk to people face to face. So maybe I'm going on a tangent there in terms of the dependency, but here, I mean, I guess this is an answer, but my own experience or my own bias is 2 things. When GPSs first came out, I love maps, and I used to have this, spiral bound map that I kept in my trunk. And so it's like,
some big fan of those. Yeah.
Yeah, and I try to find out where I am. And with GPS,
Judah, you do realize like half the listeners are like, what the hell are you guys talking about?
yeah, what's a map? Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Well, just the spiral bound atlases,
Spiral bound,
like,
I know.
love,
Yes.
but I have a US one and I have a New Hampshire specific one in my garage right now. So yeah.
You still have them. That's
I
great.
still have them. Yes. Well, just as a quick aside here is that, when I first moved to New Hampshire 20 years ago, I would do a lot of work in the community and I've kind of crisscrossed the state. So having that, and again, this was pre GPS. And so that New Hampshire atlas is well thumbed, if you will. And, now I know how to get to all these far flung places pretty intuitively, just based off of that experience within New Hampshire and Vermont. But anyway, I go ahead.
Yeah. Since we're aligned. Yeah. It took me some years to remove the atlas from my trunk after I got a GPS, because my thing at first was, sure, GPS can get you point A to point B, but I need to know, the full picture of where I'm going. Otherwise, I just felt lost. I don't know if I'm going north, south, east, and stuff like that. So, Bill Heward has some articles with the title, and he's big on low tech approaches to such and such. So he also believes in low tech. I guess I haven't asked in the last 20 years or heard, but anyway, he had, and just one other example of my own bias on this was my daughters got to the age when having a device in their room to play music made sense, right? And my father-in-law, who loves devices and gadgets, was like, well, we'll get them the, Alexa, whatever those are called, Echo Dot type thing. And I said, no, they need CDs and boombox so they can learn that, this is, the music was placed on this thing, and then you put it in this thing and you close it and you push play so that it makes sense, that it's like, it's not just coming out of the wall, and I got voted down, but, yeah, I don't know, technology moves a little too fast, and I agree. I think we'd be lost if anything breaks down, and
yeah. I mean, I would say that much in the same way of that NEEF improvisational study that you mentioned earlier, having some ability to recognize, direction, roads, etc., gives one some ability to improvise if, the GPSs are wrong. We used to have back before, Google and Apple Maps and things like that, when you had the GPS that was like, suction cup to your windshield. We had a Garmin device that would just every once in a while just decide to freeze. And so it'd be like in the middle of a road trip, and it's like, I'm like, every once in a while I'd glance over and I'm like, we're really not making much oh crap, it's doing it again. So they have to get the the find a paper clip to unwind and, hit the reset, the little tiny reset thing in it, and anyway, lots of grist for that mill, I suppose, that will perhaps put up.
Or even, I think it still comes out when you're in a really busy city, you can't get a signal, or
yes,
real rural area, you can't get a signal. And so, what do I do? Oh, my GPS doesn't work, right? How will I know where to go?
Oh, that happened to me when I was driving around Northeast. Oh, yeah, real quick. Audience listeners, thank you for bearing with us through this. I'll just make this brief. But like when I went down to take my son to Northeastern a few weeks ago, the GPS sent me into the courtyard of the campus.
Yeah.
And I was so unfamiliar with the area because I don't go to Boston that frequently, and B, I don't go to that part of Boston all that frequently. And actually drove into it very briefly. I'm like, oh crap, okay. And I just pulled a reverse and, probably, upset a lot of people in the process and whatnot, And of course they probably saw the New Hampshire plates and were like, shake their head in dismay. But anyway, so things like that happen all the time, and if you don't know your general whereabouts and stuff like that, then that was a situation where I guess me as the old crank was a little too over reliant on the GPS and failed to apply common sense. So it affects all of us, I suppose. So
I just had the same thing where Franconia area. We went to go on a hike. We picked one out. It was a bald mountain. And I put in Google bald mountain, and it took us to just the side of the road that was in the closest point to the middle of Bald Mountain. And my wife's like, you have to put in the trailhead, Bald Mountain Trail. Oh, okay.
Indeed, indeed. All right, so I'm sure we could trade anecdotes on this in this general bent for quite some time, but we do have to wrap this up. So, Judah, I really appreciate this. Really, this conversation's a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed it and learned a lot. I want to give you the opportunity, if there's any final word on problem solving that we haven't covered, or if you think we've done enough for today, feel free to close us out with some advice for the newly minted, whether it has to do with problem solving or not.
Yeah, I think we covered everything about problem solving. I guess I'll say two additional areas that I've worked on with my students. Well, I'll share one additional area, which is reading comprehension, right? Because that's really hard for a lot of kids. And you read a passage and you say, it asks, where was the main character going after dinner? And it's, it doesn't come immediately. I have to engage in some problem solving of either looking at my notes from my reading or going back into the text and then finding the answer and coming up with it. So I just think reading comprehension is another ripe area for problem solving. And I thought about advice to the newly minted BCBA, because I know you ask it a lot or all the time with guests. And I came up with three things that I think people, they're a little contradictory. So it's the need to balance these things. And one of them, the first, is to study and really get to know the basic principles of behavior analysis, because they will help you answer difficult clinical problems, right? There was a point I mentioned that I worked with Mark Sundberg, and certainly early on, there'd be a clinical challenge and I would have no idea what to do. And he would say, well, look at this and look at this, and we could do this and we should do this. And I'd say, man, this guy must just, know so much about behavior analysis, studied it for decades, to just see this clinical problem and come up with an answer right away. And I got over the years that it's almost always going back to the Skinner box, the basic lab situation, and that can really elucidate answers for clinical problems.
Let me, I guess, accentuate that point. And this is not intentional to have a callback to the Verbal Behavior Conference, but Ed Blakely gave an amazing series of talks on clinical problem solving, on like you're talking about blocking and overshadowing and all. It's like from Honig and Stadden stuff,
Mm-hmm.
And it was awesome. That was at last year's Verbal Behavior Conference. So yeah, I totally, I just want to, vociferously agree with you on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's great. One other comment on that point I'll say is that Jack Michael's 1995 paper in the Behavior Analyst, titled "What Every Student of Behavior Analysis Should Know," I love to teach because, well, for many reasons, but a big one is that an SD in basic research to the true definition of an SD is also a condition reinforcer. And that took me a while to wrap my head around. And I think takes people, because an SD evokes a behavior that produces a reinforcer. So the SD is a stimulus that's been paired with that reinforcer. So it becomes a condition reinforcer if we're using the true definitions and the basic definitions and procedures. Yeah. So yeah, I love that one. And a second one is, I think, always, seeing what goes on in your program and always thinking about how could we do this better? That I think a lot of our procedures and way we do things were written down a long time ago now. And I think there can always be ways to do this. That was a big lesson I learned from Vince Carbone. That big mission that he had was to take the way that people did discrete trial teaching and try to make it better. What do we know from current research that would make this more effective? And often the newly minted BCBA cannot have that much influence, but start thinking about it, start bringing it up, suggesting it, seeing, those sorts of things. And my final one is to be confident with your recommendations. That took me a little while to get, but also at the same time, humble with others' perspectives, right? So balancing that confidence and that humility, which are both super important to be effective BCBAs.
I like that. I like that a lot. Dr. Judah Axe, this has been a fun conversation. Thanks so much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you again in Austin, Texas at the Verbal Behavior Conference.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Matt. I enjoyed it.
Hey there, real quick before we get to the outro music, I just want to say thanks for tuning in for the entire episode. This is a long one. It's pretty conceptual, a lot of stuff going on, and you hung around for all of it. So congrats. Go to behavioralobservations.com, hit the contact button, shoot me an email. Let me know what you thought of this episode, and let me know if there are other topics you'd like to hear more of. So I do read all the emails that come through. I can't respond to every single one of them, but I absolutely do read them. So thanks so much for tuning in. Also, as a reminder, there are comprehensive show notes over at behavioralobservations.com. And while you're there, jump on the mailing list if you're not already. It's 100% non-spammy. I don't share the emails with anyone, so you're not going to get random emails from places. Well, you might get random emails from places, but that has nothing to do with me. So, to recap, A, thank you for listening to the entire show, and B, go to the show notes to learn more. We've got the studies that we talked about that are linked, and here's something that's pretty cool. Every once in a while, I miss some studies that are discussed in these episodes, so if we talk about a study and we miss one, hit me up. Again, go to behavioralobservations.com, hit the contact page, and let me know how I screwed up. All right, thanks so much for listening to the show again. Thanks for Judah's time, and yeah, if you want to learn more about him, I've got links to his Simmons page and his LinkedIn and all that stuff. So, all right, we'll see you in the next session of the Behavioral Observations Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.